I spent my whole childhood trying to get my family to notice when I was struggling. They never did. So in my late 20s, I quietly stopped telling them anything. Their reaction to my silence broke something open in me that I'm still trying to understand. This is long. I've rewritten it 4 times. I keep cutting things and then putting them back because I'm not sure which parts matter, and I've decided they probably all do. Make yourself comfortable. My name isn't important. I'm 31. I live alone in a city about 4 hours from where I grew up. I have a decent job, a small apartment with too many plants, and a therapist named Marcus who I see every other Tuesday and who assigned me, in a loose sense, to write this down. He didn't say post it to the internet. But he also knows me well enough to know that I process things better when I imagine someone on the other side of them.
So, hi.
You're the other side of this. The house I grew up in. I want to describe my family carefully because I think the temptation, when you read a story like this, is to cast them as villains. They weren't villains. That's actually the whole problem. Villains are easier. My parents, Pat and Dennis, are good people in most of the ways that are visible to other people. They showed up to things. They paid for things. They remembered birthdays and made dinners and drove carpool and volunteered at the school fundraiser. From the outside, and largely from the inside, we were a functional, stable, ordinary family. I have 2 older brothers, Ryan and Cole. Ryan is 5 years older than me and Cole is 3 years older. By the time I was in middle school, they had both calcified into the family's emotional climate in ways that were inconvenient for me specifically. Ryan was the responsible one. Cole was the funny one. I was, and I mean this in the most affectionately hollow way, the one who was also there. I don't think my parents played favorites in any deliberate way. I think what happened is subtler and harder to name. I was quieter than my brothers, less immediately legible, and my family, without anyone deciding this, simply developed a habit of attending to what was loudest. Ryan's college applications. Cole's broken arm. Ryan's breakup. Cole's car accident. The sequence of events that filled a family's years. When I had things, they were smaller things. Or they seemed smaller. Or I didn't present them loudly enough to compete. The specific memories. I'll give you a few, not to build a case, but because abstract claims about feeling invisible are hard to hold on to and specifics are easier. When I was 11, I was being bullied at school by a boy named Marcus Teller. Not my therapist, different Marcus, an unfortunate coincidence, who had decided I was a useful target for about 4 months of that year. It was nothing that left marks. Name-calling mostly. Being excluded in pointed and architectural ways. The particular cruelty that 11-year-olds are capable of when they've identified someone they can cost very little to hurt. I told my mom.
Twice.
The first time she said, "Oh, try to ignore him. He probably just wants attention." The second time I brought it up, she said, "I thought you sorted that out," in a tone that was so certain I had sorted it out that I didn't know how to explain that I hadn't.
So I said yeah.
And I went upstairs. And I sorted it out eventually on my own, the way you do when you're 11 and there's no one operating the levers. When I was 15, I failed 3 classes in a single semester. This required a level of dedicated underperformance that should have raised flags the size of buildings. My parents were called in. There was a meeting. What came out of that meeting from my parents' side was essentially a logistics conversation, tutoring, scheduling, study habits. What nobody asked, at the meeting or afterward, was why. The why was that I had been sleeping 11 hours a night and still waking up tired and crying in the shower most mornings and feeling like I was moving through something thick and resistant that I didn't have a name for yet. Depression is the name for it. But I was 15 and I didn't know that, and no one thought to ask. When I was 20, home from college for winter break, I had a panic attack in the upstairs bathroom on Christmas Eve. I sat on the tile floor for 45 minutes. My family ate appetizers downstairs. I came down eventually with a rinsed face, and my mom said, "There you are, we thought you'd fallen asleep," and handed me a bread roll. I'm not angry about the bread roll.
I want to be clear about that. She didn't know.
That's exactly the point. She didn't know because I had stopped, by then, making any effort to show her. The withdrawal. At some point in my mid-20s, I'd place it around 26, maybe 27, I made a decision that wasn't entirely conscious at the time but that I've come to understand pretty clearly since. I stopped. Not dramatically. I didn't announce it. I didn't send an email or sit anyone down or make a declaration. I just quietly, incrementally stopped offering my family any real information about my interior life. When they asked how I was, I said good or fine or busy, the way you answer a cashier. When my mom called on Sundays, and she did call every Sunday, which is its own complicated fact, I kept things on the surface. Work stuff. Weather stuff. A funny thing that happened at the grocery store. When I went through a genuinely brutal period at 27, a job I lost, an apartment situation that was borderline unlivable for 3 months, a relationship ending in a way that gutted me, I told my family essentially nothing. I mentioned the job thing briefly when they asked why I'd gotten a new email address through my new employer. I didn't mention the apartment or the relationship at all. This didn't feel like punishment at the time. I want to be honest about my own motivations because Marcus, therapist Marcus, has pushed me on this a lot. I didn't stop telling them things to hurt them, or to teach them a lesson, or to wait for them to notice. I stopped because somewhere in my late 20s I had accumulated enough self-awareness to understand that telling my family things and then receiving inadequate responses was more painful than not telling them at all. The absence of support is one kind of pain. The active experience of reaching out and being met with a bread roll, metaphorically or literally, is a different and sharper kind of pain. I was protecting myself. It was that simple. What I didn't account for. Here's where the story changes. About 2 years into my quiet withdrawal, so I'm 28, almost 29, my brother Cole calls me on a Wednesday. Not Sunday. Wednesday. Cole almost never calls me. We're friendly, but we're not close in the way that produces Wednesday calls. I answer assuming something has happened to one of our parents. He says everything's fine. He says he's just calling to check in. I say, with genuine bewilderment, why? He laughs a little awkwardly and says he's just been thinking about me. He asks how I actually am. He puts a noticeable emphasis on actually, which tells me the question is deliberate. I give him the standard answer. Fine, good, busy. He says, yeah, but actually though. I don't know what to do with this. I change the subject to something about a TV show we'd both watched, and he lets me, but before he hangs up he says, I know you probably think we don't notice stuff. I just want you to know that's not. I don't know.
I've been thinking about that.
That's all. He hangs up. I sit with my phone in my hand for a while. Then my mother. 3 weeks later, my mom calls on a Sunday, as usual. Normal. Standard Sunday architecture. How's work? How's the weather? Did I see that thing in the news? And then she stops. And she says, in a voice that is slightly different from her Sunday voice, slightly more careful, can I ask you something? I say sure. She says, are you lonely?
Just that.
3 words. I don't answer for long enough that she starts to backtrack. You don't have to answer that, I just. And I say, no, why are you asking that? And she says, because you used to tell me things. When you were small, even when you were in college a little bit, you used to, there would be things you'd share. And somewhere along the way you stopped, and I think for a long time I didn't notice, and then I noticed and I didn't say anything, and now it's been a long time, and I'm saying something. I sit down on my kitchen floor. I'm not sure why I sit on the floor. My legs just make that decision. She keeps talking. She says she's been talking to her own therapist. I didn't know she had a therapist, and that some of what they'd talked about was how she'd handled or failed to handle certain things when we were growing up. She doesn't go into details. She doesn't issue a comprehensive formal apology. She just says, I think I missed a lot. I think I was busy missing it, and that sounds like an excuse, and maybe it is. I just want to know how you actually are. I tell her I'm fine. She says, okay. Quiet. Okay. You don't have to tell me. I just want you to know the door is, I want there to be a door. If that's something you want. What I felt.
Confused.
That's the most accurate word. Not moved, not immediately. Not tearful, the way I think I would have been at 15 or 20 or 23. Something more complicated than that. Because here's the thing about spending years and years adjusting to a particular temperature. When the temperature changes, your first instinct isn't gratitude. It's suspicion. It's the low animal wariness of someone who has learned that a thing doesn't happen, being confronted with the thing happening. I spent about 2 weeks trying to figure out if it was real. I kept waiting for it to evaporate. I kept expecting the next Sunday call to go back to normal, weather, news, bread rolls, and the Wednesday that Cole called to have been some isolated blip. I kept myself at a careful distance from the possibility that something had actually shifted because the cost of believing in a shift that turned out to be temporary felt too high. But the calls kept coming. Not constantly, not suffocatingly, but with a new quality to them. Questions that waited for real answers. Silences that weren't immediately filled. My mom asking once, carefully, about the relationship that had ended. She didn't know it had ended. I never told her, but she said, I got the impression there was someone for a while, and I said yes, and she said, do you want to talk about it? And I said not really, and she said okay, and meant it. That okay did something to me that I'm still processing. The conversation with Ryan. My oldest brother Ryan is not a feelings person. He's an engineer. He speaks in solutions. Our entire lives, a conversation with Ryan about something emotional has lasted approximately 90 seconds before he starts troubleshooting. He calls me 4 months after Cole's Wednesday call. He says he wants to come visit. He's going to be passing through my city for work, and could we get dinner? We get dinner. Italian place near my apartment. We talk about his kids, his job, a project he's working on. Normal stuff. And then somewhere in the second course, Ryan puts down his fork and looks at me the way he used to look at math problems in high school, like something doesn't add up and it's bothering him. He says, were you unhappy when we were kids? I look at him. He says, like genuinely, were you unhappy and we just did we miss it? I say something non-committal. I say it was fine. Growing up is hard for everyone. He says, that's not an answer. I look at my pasta for a while. I say, yeah, sometimes. I don't think anyone really noticed. He nods. Slowly. He picks his fork back up and then puts it back down. He says, I was 17 when you were 12. I was pretty self-absorbed at 17. I say most 17-year-olds are. He says, yeah, but you were my brother. And then he picks his fork up again and eats his pasta, and we don't talk about it anymore for the rest of the dinner. But when we hug goodbye outside the restaurant, he holds on a beat longer than usual. Ryan, who I have hugged approximately 40 times in my life with a standard duration of a person patting a friendly dog. I walked home slowly that night. What I've come to understand. I've been unpacking this in therapy for about 8 months now. Marcus, and I have spent a lot of sessions on the central confusion of it, which is this. I spent years withdrawing from my family because the experience of being unseen felt worse than simply not being looked at. And then, when I stopped offering them anything to see, something in the absence apparently made them look harder. I don't know what to do with that causally. I'm not recommending withdrawal as a strategy. I'm not saying that if you stop talking, people will suddenly hear you. I don't think that's a lesson. What I think is truer is something Marcus said a few months ago, which is that sometimes families are not bad at caring. They're bad at noticing. And those are different problems with different solutions. The first one is a character failure. The second one is a failure of attention, which can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be interrupted by enough time, by their own therapy, by their own incremental accumulating of self-awareness, by the particular shape of your silence becoming finally loud enough to register. My family is not fixed. We are not suddenly close in the movie sense. My mom still says things sometimes that land wrong. Cole still deflects with jokes at moments that don't need jokes. Ryan still troubleshoots. These are old and deeply grooved patterns, and they don't dissolve because of a few phone calls and one long dinner. But my mom calls now and sometimes asks how I actually am. And sometimes I tell her something true. Just something small. Just enough to practice. And she doesn't hand me a bread roll. The last thing. I went home for my mom's birthday in October. Dinner, the 5 of us, the house I grew up in. After dinner, my dad, who I haven't mentioned much because he is a quiet peripheral presence in this story the way he was in my childhood, came and sat next to me on the back porch while everyone else was inside. We sat there for a while. My dad is not a talker. We watched the backyard go dark. He said eventually, your mother thinks we weren't very good at paying attention. To you specifically. I said I thought that was probably fair. He said, I think she's right. He paused. I think I'm not very good at knowing what to do when something's wrong, and I can't fix it. So sometimes I just didn't look. He didn't apologize. My dad doesn't really apologize. It's not a thing he does. But he said, I'm looking now for whatever it's worth. I didn't say anything. We sat there until it was fully dark. Then we went inside and had birthday cake.
It's worth something.
I'm still figuring out how much.
But it's worth something.
And I think that's the most honest ending I have. To anyone who grew up feeling like a background character in your own family story, I see you. I was you. And I don't know if it gets better, but I know sometimes it gets different, and different turned out to be more than I'd let myself hope for.